Good evening, everyone. My name's Shawana Andrews. I'm the Associate Dean Indigenous in the faculty, and I'll be your host for the evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences Dean's Lecture this evening. Thank you to those attending in person and to all of you online who I know are also there behind the camera. To begin the evening, I'd like to acknowledge country and the lands on which we gather and pay our collective respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation who have been custodians of the lands for millennia. I pay respects to all elders who are here today and others who are our knowledge keepers and whom offer their wisdom with kindness, as well as to all Indigenous children who are the holders of our Indigenous horizons. Wurundjeri people invite us to come to their lands with purpose. So I'd like to ask that of you today. Come with purpose, listen with intent, and act for change. And if you know anything about our guests' work, you'll understand what I mean by that. Professor Sandra Eads, our Deputy Dean Indigenous, who unfortunately cannot be here tonight due to family business, has led a strategic vision for the faculty that centres Indigenous health, equity and leadership development. This evening we'll be privileged to hear from Professor Cindy Blackstock, who will deliver the Dean's Lecture prior to a week of engagements across the faculty. Professor Blackstock is the third visiting fellow the faculty has hosted with a view to enhancing global Indigenous friendships across mutual areas of interest and to develop our understanding of the global context in which our work sits. So please settle in for what I think will be an amazing lecture. And I'll now invite our Dean, Professor Jane Gunn, to come up and say a few words and to formally introduce our guest tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Shawana, and hello everyone. I also want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and extend this respect to all First Nations people joining us here today. I also want to note that Professor Sandra Eads can't be with us here this evening, but I know that she's definitely behind us as we head towards this wonderful oration. I'm delighted that this is the third year that we have brought an outstanding Indigenous scholar to talk to our community about things that really matter. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Cindy Blackstock for a very special Dean's Lecture called Loving Justice, the Colonialism Antidote. Now, as researchers, teachers, educators, people that think deeply about what matters within the faculty, I know that everyone here this evening really wants to make a difference to health and wellbeing of our communities, and it drives us to really do the best that we can. The university has been contributing to health and wellbeing for over 150 years, but as we know in the truth-telling book, Dumbuk Gubgawana, that has recently been published by the university, we haven't always done the best that we can do. And so as we step into the future, that's something that we want to both acknowledge the past and the healing that was required, but also look towards the future and the way that we can do things differently. Because, as we know, the world will continue to change. It poses new challenges every day, and the way that we do things needs to evolve. But one of the things that I care very deeply about is that we can learn so much from the past, and we can learn so much by people that can come from another place to talk to us about things that matter to us, and in particular how we might respond to issues of healthcare in all the communities that we serve. Now, we know it's a fact that First Nations communities globally are disproportionately affected by health issues. This is a lasting legacy from colonisation, and it's one that we want to reverse, and we want to be working really actively to make a difference. And I know we're all committed to that and making that happen. Of course, we need to always be open-minded to new ways of being able to work towards a better future for all. So we are committed to addressing Indigenous health and equity in Australia and to transforming health outcomes for Indigenous peoples globally. And so part of that means that we foster partnerships and we collaborate with others because we know that one thing is for sure, we do not have all the answers. We want to respect Indigenous knowledges, and we want to strengthen the supportive, inclusive and diverse culture that's here within our faculty, and we want that to become even stronger. And so with all of this in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Cindy Blackstock, OC, a member of the Gitxsan First Nation in Canada, a social worker, author, professor and advocate. Now, Cindy, I'm going to say a few words about you so you can settle in for a little while. So Cindy Blackstock is nationally and internationally respected, and that is for her advocacy for the rights of Indigenous children. She is the co-founder and executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, a professor at McGill University School of Social Work, and Chancellor of the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. So a very busy person. In a social work career spanning over 25 years, with experience in child protection and Indigenous children's rights, her research has focused on Indigenous theory and the identification and remediation of structural inequalities affecting First Nations children, youth and families in Canada. In 1999, Cindy co-founded and became the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. This society conducts research, advocates for change with the federal and provincial governments, and offers support for agencies caring for Indigenous children, families and communities. In 2007, the Caring Society and the Assembly of First Nations filed a suit against the federal government with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. They argued that the federal government's policies and funding practices discriminated against Indigenous children based on race. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled in favour of the Caring Society. There's a lot of years between 2007 and 2016. And maybe we'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. It stated that the federal government's chronic underfunding of Indigenous child services was an act of discrimination. So a $23.34 billion compensation was awarded and $20 billion was allocated for reforms to on-reserve child welfare and family services. Cindy received the 2023 World Children's Prize for her work with First Nations communities for the historic human rights case substantiating Canada's discrimination in First Nations child and family services. And Cindy has collaborated with other Indigenous leaders to assist the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child in the development and adoption of a general comment on the rights of Indigenous children, another thing that's not so easy to get to have happen. Recently, she also worked with Indigenous young people, UNICEF and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to produce a youth-friendly version of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child. As we strive in this faculty to improve health outcomes locally and globally and to reduce Indigenous health inequity, we can learn a lot from hearing Cindy speak about her experience of advocating on behalf of Indigenous children and their families in Canada. It is a wonderful delight that we have you here as our guest. So I'd like to welcome you, Cindy, to the lectern. Thank you.
So it's a great honor to be on these lands, these very sacred lands, among these very sacred people. You know, the world it feels like there's been so much progress in the struggle towards reclaiming our humanity in its best forms and respecting people's rights and understanding that respecting people's rights doesn't mean that we somehow give up our own rights. That conversation has been hard fought, not only for First Nations peoples, but for women, for members of gender diverse communities, and more. But over this last 5-6 years, we've seen the storm clouds brewing that are about creating dichotomies of it's me or it's you, and I'd rather it be me, that feed on people's fears and that really disregard the truth in favor of algorithms, in favor of quick answers, and unfortunately often in favor of plugging into the worst of our emotions. One of the questions I have to ask myself is, with the US election, and you should be very pleased that you have the Pacific Ocean between you now. I don't enjoy that same benefit. But how is it that we confront these forces? How do we protect the gains made by so many of our ancestors collectively? And how do we then push the conversation forward to achieve even more justice where that's required? And one of our elders, his name is Elmer Kershane. And he said very clearly early on, when we were dealing with what really were apartheid public services that had been normalized in Canadian society. You see, the reality is that for decades and decades, First Nations peoples were getting less, but being judged by a public who thought they were getting more. And that allowed for that discrimination to travel on from one generation to another. And it framed the problem as, we're not grateful. That's the problem. And only if we were more grateful and pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps, we could enjoy all the bounty of this new land called Canada. But that kind of stereotype, that kind of antidote, it had ancestors, and it also had an architecture perpetrated by colonialism. Elder Elmer Kershane said the answer to addressing those dark forces is not tears, it's not anger, and it's not frustration. All of those things fuel that type of emotion. You're going to feel that way, especially seeing children. As one non-Indigenous child said, discrimination is when you're not worth the money. And I saw so many children who were being treated by the government of Canada as if they weren't worth the money. But to really get at that, we had to approach it in a way that was based on loving justice. And that type of discipline that's required, the type of creativity that's required, is much more work and effort and intellectual effort than the angry, the tears, and what gets framed as protest. But I think he's really right, because when we think about colonialism as its epicenter, it's really one of the grand forms of discrimination. It creates a dichotomy. The savage, that would be us, and the civilized, everything kind of in a university, right? And all of that stuff gets manifested and normalized in common ways. Like, one of the things I think that's such a kind of a general difference between Indigenous peoples and others is that we actually think our ancestors were mostly right about some of the big questions of how to live a good life in a sustainable environment, whereas non-Indigenous people think their ancestors are mostly wrong and their ideas are to be improved on. And academia is structured on this ideas of improving on. You have to have a 2024 site if you're writing your dissertation. Otherwise, you've missed some of the coming research. There's just an automatic privilege that comes with those particular spaces. So that's one of the earliest things in the birth certificates of our respective countries. In Canada and Australia, that type of savage and civilized dichotomy was born right in there. And in the United States, in the Declaration of Independence, in Article 2, it actually says the merciless Indian savages, right in the birth certificate of the country. Now, we can talk about colonialism, and one of the definitions I like is the one by Eduardo Galeano. And he talks about blatant colonialism, and this is what we often think of, you know, the taking of lands, the stolen generations in Australia, in Canada, the residential schools, and the 60s scoop and more. But I actually argue, I think that the most potent form is the invisible one. It's when discrimination becomes so normalized that we don't see it anymore. When Canadians are able to walk to a protest on apartheid in South Africa and travel right past the Department of Indian Affairs and not give it a second look. But there's more to it even than that, in that it affects the way that we think. For so many years, I was a fellow traveler on doing these things with the government of Canada to create change that had I looked backwards, had always not resulted in change. So what did I have to do to kind of shape my own thinking? What did I talk about the kind of the personal applications of colonialism? Well, first of all, we have the dichotomy. And we hear this a lot in this kind of discourse. But the dichotomies just by nature, they eliminate the multiple identities we all have, those points of connection that allow us to have those harder conversations. All of a sudden, the big marker for me is that I'm Gitxsan and I'm First Nations, and others are not, versus kind of embracing the whole humanity of people and allowing for multiple connections across and then dealing with those essential issues. It dehumanizes. That's what a dichotomy does really well. It strips away that humanity. And when it strips away that humanity, it not only normalizes discrimination, it legitimizes it. In many cases, it's a higher moral good. We're doing this for you, you just don't appreciate what we're doing for you so far. It imposes language. Like one of the words I'm very uncomfortable using is healing. Because why would we use a word that means recovery from illness to describe our people that have stood on intergenerational strength for tens of thousands of years? Why is it when there's an injustice done to us, the conversation is about the healing we need to do versus the remedying of the injustice of those who perpetrate it? It ingrains discriminatory relationships. So we have ways of relating to the Canadian government in the past. So we would do negotiation with Canada, and that negotiation was seen as a better form than litigation. You've maybe heard that here. But negotiation hasn't got us very far. It's a colonial play park. And yet we've kind of done those ways of relating, or photo ops with ministers. Like, why do we want to meet with these people? They know what we want. What we have to do is create a social context in which makes them make a different choice. Why is it that we say that governments are failing to act on the many solutions that are put forward? They're not failing to act, they're choosing not to act. That's a different thing. And when they're choosing not to act, that requires a different set of tools that are peaceful and respectful, but that force change, such as litigation, in our case. It disables resistance and it erases resistance out of the past. In Canada, I'm going to show you in a minute, it's done a lot of that with history. We talked about it a little bit this morning, about how there's a whitewashing of history that happens in colonial countries, but there's also a rightwashing of history, where non-Indigenous peoples who stood up at the time and were calling out the government, and many people were doing that, are actually written out of the story so that we can claim the narrative that, oh, well, what they did back then, they didn't know any better. They had different standards, and somehow that allows us to legitimize the inhumanity. This is a newspaper article from 1907. And it was from, I've gotten kind of two of them there. One is from the Victoria Colonist, which is on the west coast of Canada. And then the other is from Toronto, Saturday Night Magazine. You saw the headlines about the children in unmarked graves in Canada. This was the headline news. It was a national story back in 1907. And it was breaking because the public health officer at that time, Dr. Bryce, a federal employee, had blown the whistle on the unnecessary deaths of children in the schools. There's something really important, I think, in the Saturday Night Magazine article that has a lot of contemporary currency. It says, his report is printed. Many people will scan the cover. Some will open it. A few will read it. And so the thing will drift along for another year, and so with the next year and the year after that. And such will be the course of events. The protests of medical officers buried in blue books, the complaints of missionaries lost in pigeonholes, and here's where we have to awaken. Unless public opinion takes up the question and forces it up to the front. Then Parliament will take a quick interest. Pigeonholes will give forth their dusty contents. Medical health officers will have a wealth of ideas and a scandalous procession of Indian children to the school and on to the cemetery may be stopped. We've always been the antidote. We just simply haven't embraced that responsibility. And too often in academia, we become fellow travelers in this redocumentation of all of the problems and presenting solutions without looking backwards and seeing if it's a question that's not about problem identification, it's not about manufacturing solutions, it's about ensuring that those land on the ground and the injustice stops. And academics do that in a variety of ways, right? Through research grants, through different types of contracts, sometimes with class action lawyers, participating in royal commissions. Like, these things are endless, they're procedures, but they don't actually change anything for people on the ground. So one of the articles that I wish I would have done when I started was look backwards more myself. And that was part of that colonial thinking, is that I assumed Canada was treating First Nations children in the way they were because they didn't have the answers. Even I, like, who came from a First Nations community, was so overcome with this sensibility that they mustn't know better, so we have to do reports to show them better. Had I looked back and all of these things, works by Bryce and others, and looked at the words of Jerry Gamble, I might have been a little bit less willing to write those reports. This is from Jerry is actually a former employee of Indian Affairs in 1958, and he was just fired from his job for getting too close to the Indians. And you can see here that he's enunciating what turn out to be about 25 strategies government uses to steal Indian human rights, is what he says. And a couple of them just really have some currency. The one is the be patient speech. Like, that is one of the ones that normalize and don't awaken us as a public to force things to the front. Somehow, we're supposed to be patient about the necessity of getting clean water into your First Nations community. We're doing everything we can. Change can't happen overnight, and it's very complex to do that. In response to all of that, we often just don't ask a second or third question. We don't ask ourselves, why is it possible for the government of Canada to have clean drinking water and high-speed internet in the space station, population 6, but somehow say that it's way too complicated to go and deliver clean water to a First Nations community? We somehow become comfortable with these thought patterns that we have to disrupt. This idea that you're using proper channels. You don't want to litigate against us. You want to negotiate with us. You want to sit with the minister, we'll figure it out. But that is often a path to nowhere, right? If they want to do something, they should be able to do it very quickly. Governments do a lot of big things very quickly. We saw it during the pandemic. I give our government credit for rolling out the vaccines as they did, right? For example, that was a good step. So they can do this kind of thing. They're just choosing not to do it. And at the bottom was one that really kind of got to me, is when they get you to a point where you're actually thanking them for their discrimination. Where, for example, we have broad sweeping inequalities in, like, our education system. And the government will build a new school in one community. The teachers will still have far less funding for their salaries, far less funding for their tools. The youth are not going to have the same kind of access to culturally based education. But somehow we're going to be in a photo op with the minister thanking them for this school, to say nothing about the inequalities of other people. Why is it that we're thankful for the discrimination? Why do we feel we have to be grateful for the discrimination? And then part of that is the embedding of that scarcity narrative. If I don't show you I'm grateful, then maybe my kids don't get that school at all, right? So part of it is, we were talking earlier today with a group, and I just want to acknowledge some of our colleagues in Western Australia. Thank you for coming this morning. We use the word overrepresented. I don't like that word either. It's too easy to say. If we really want to talk about what the impacts of the injustice are, when we looked at that for First Nations kids, I thought, well, how would a kid think about it, right? They aren't going to say I'm overrepresented in child welfare. They're going to say, how many sleeps till I see my mom? Right? That's what they're going to ask. So why don't we measure it that way? And when we did that, the number of nights that First Nations children had spent away from their families came to well over 67 million, and that's just on reserve. And that gives you more of a sense of the gravity of the injustice. And I think we have to awaken ourselves. Certainly I did have to awaken myself, because you're so used to dealing with this stuff that somehow it does become normal. We forget about the individual child that night who's going to sleep away from their family. The other thing that happened is that we've created these responses to the discrimination that, in my view, miss the target. And one of those is in child welfare. And I full disclosure, I was a frontline worker in child welfare for 15 years. And I will say just flat out that that was probably the most difficult and most important job I've ever had, is working directly with those families and with those young people. But when we look at the overrepresentation rate, or the number of sleeps of First Nations kids in care, we can see that First Nations are about 17.2 times more likely to be in foster care than others. These types of statistics have been going on for years. And the problem has not been getting less. It's been getting worse, right? And now we have real challenges with the opioid crisis in Canada. So we're actually having what we call opioid orphans. Isn't that a horrible thing, where children are left without any parents because their parents have been fallen victims to addictions? But when you look at the reasons why that's happening, it's all of these things like domestic violence, the poverty, the mental health, the poor housing. Many of these are manifestations of the inequality that has been passed down. It's not just the trauma that was passed down or the strength that was passed down, it's the inequality that continues to bear on the people trying to recover. And yet our response is to codify all of those problems at an individual level. We create statutory frameworks where we say that neglect, which is the most likely reason that children are placed into child welfare care in Canada, is because you're unable or unwilling to parent that child. And then when that system results in so many children going into care, what we do is we spend all of our time up there fixing child welfare. I've argued for a long time child welfare is not the problem. The problem is all those drivers at the bottom and those same drivers are fueling the overrepresentation of First Nations peoples among poor health outcomes, amongst the young persons who are incarcerated. It's the same fire. And yet we're only dealing with this stuff in silos, and sadly, we don't collaborate very much, right? It requires much more of an interdisciplinary kind of approach. So here's my thing on the reports to nowhere. And if I leave you to one message is, do not write another report on what all the stuff is happening for us until you look back, right? And here's just a series of the reports that I got. That I did not follow my own advice because I was naive back then, probably still am. But that first report we did in 2000, it showed that the First Nations kids were getting about 73 cents on the dollar compared to non-Indigenous kids in child welfare. When the government then said, oh, that's a good report, but we need something more detailed, right? So then they get us all as fellow travelers to do another report. But this time, thankfully, there's some people in the room that are smarter than I am, and that we decided to convene experts who are willing to be expert witnesses, right? And you're starting to think about how do you plant the seed where you're not just trying non-voluntary change and then exhausting that road and then switching over. You actually launch both at the same time. Because children's lives and childhoods were on the line with these delays. We couldn't afford to not to just rely on one strategy or the other. They both had to be launched simultaneously. But by the time we did this report, the inequality had grown to 30%. And then we saw some data that showed that in the time we had been sitting around the table talking to the Canadian government, the number of First Nations children going into child welfare care had risen roughly 71%. And there's something that's really kind of intoxicating about being a part of these reports, because it feels like you're doing something, right? And all of us get into these various fields because of that very aim. But I could stack the number of reports on child welfare higher than this lectern, right? And if you went to the community, did they make any difference for you? No. And that's the other thing that happens is process replaces our sight on what the actual outcome is. That it doesn't matter that you did a good report if the child's life has not changed for the better in ways that they would self-define. But I would also say to the government that this is the biggest public policy bungle in Canadian history. Had they implemented the recommendations we came up with in 2000, it would have been hundreds of millions of dollars to fix. But sadly, they didn't do it. And they argued on procedural matters to get the case dismissed. It was only when they were forced into it that they actually did something. And we've had 25 non-compliance orders against the Canadian government, including one just this week. So it has been dragging them across the equality line. But so far, this case has cost them nearly $50 billion. Why? Because they had to pay compensation to the children they discriminated against. Meager amounts, really, compared to losing your childhood and in some cases losing your life. And then they're having to fix the system, but guess what has happened in those 20 years where those families weren't given the supports that they needed, right? It's like lighting a little burning match and then just setting it near a big thing of fire. And so far, we have all of these extra problems and trauma. The rate of overrepresentation went from 6 to 7 times up to 19 or 17.2 times, right? So this all leaves us in this conundrum. So this is the case, in case any of you want to kind of take a look at it. I think it was really interesting in terms of the psychology on our side to even file it. Because we had for so long just been this rote thing about, well, let's meet with the government and do these pieces. But we had some really great elders that provided us guidance. One of them said, never fall in love with the caring society. Never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the children because you may have to sacrifice both those things for them. And when we filed the case, within 30 days, Canada took immediate action. I remember thinking, we're going to file this thing and the government will know we're serious and finally they're going to help the kids. Well, they did know we were serious and they cut all of our funding. But at that moment, then communities started rallying around, right? And up until today, we are not funded by the Canadian government other than what their court ordered for us to pay. And that gives us a lot of freedom, right? Because they control Indigenous organizations using funding agreements. We have that great book, Accounting for Genocide, by Dean New and Theron, and that still is very relevant up until today. But we had to hold Canada accountable for its current behavior. So much of the injustice that had meted out to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada, when the reports did come, they were about the past. And that gave the governments the freehold to say, well, that was ex-government before us. We're now on the watch. Or that was a different time. Or those were dark chapters. Instead of holding them accountable for the dark chapter that is happening right now. And awakening the Canadian public to it. So the case is still ongoing. And you can follow it on fnwitness.ca. But for us, it was really a major shift in the way that we would react to Canada, that we weren't waiting for Canada anymore. And that's part of the colonial kind of mindset, is you just kind of wait for them to do something. They set the pace of change, whether change happens. And so we had to disrupt that in our own selves. This is one of the passages from that 2005 report, where we talk about what is about to happen. And just like in Bryce's report, we knew the damage was about to come. So did the government, right? The government knew it was about to come. And when we went to trial, and we actually got to see the internal government documents, the government knew clearly that their behavior was resulting in the deaths of children. They knew it was harming children. They were choosing to do it anyway. And one of the most graphic exhibits I'll never forget is there was a document of a little girl who went in for dental surgery. Something went terribly wrong, and it was just before the Christmas season of 2012. Her mom was about to give birth to her sibling. And the medical team was clear that this probably is going to be this little girl's last holiday. So the request went into the Canadian government for a hospital bed that would hold her at a specific incline so that she could breathe properly during this very sacred time for the family. That form went through 15 different public servants before someone wrote on there, absolutely not. It was actually a credit to another doctor, a doctor in a hospital, who paid for the bed so that she could go home. We were running a surplus budget, but even if we weren't, how many people do you think I would get across the street in Canada that would say, don't give that child a bed, right? It's a very minute number, except for those bureaucrats. That was what they were doing. They were protecting the Canadian purse. Against what, right? What's worse is that the Canadian government actually awarded those people the highest public service prize. And it says in the award nomination, it's because they're dealing with this very contentious litigation that we had filed, and that they had managed to keep the number of cases on this, what we call Jordan's principle, keep that at a minimum number. So in the government, it was award-winning. And yet I knew many of these public servants. I knew that they were good people. What was happening on their side as I was exploring my own psychology and trying to unpack this stuff on colonialism that was necessary for loving justice, what was happening on their side? Who are their ancestors? That became the big question. Like they always talk about our ancestors, and yeah, that's important, but who are the ancestors? This place has ancestors. And they pass down normative cultural types of ways of working to us that we all kind of fall in line with naturally. And that's true with the government. In one of the moments when we were doing more recently some litigation against Canada, it rose to a place of national importance. And how we did that, by the way, is we created campaigns and situated the litigation and campaign. And we brought all kinds of kids into it. So it became an actual issue during our prime ministerial debate. And the Prime Minister's asked in the House, why are you fighting First Nations children in court? To which the Prime Minister said, we are not. And I'm literally getting ready to go to court that Monday. Like I said to myself, I said, this is like QAnon. Like, how can he stand there and say this stuff, right? And it was just then when I was listening to a podcast and I came across this guy named Stephen Hassan, who wrote the book, A Cult to Trump. And I was thinking about, I never really thought about the department as a cult before, or colonialism in the framework of undue influence, and that maybe there's something there to be understood. So let's talk about undue influence, and I'm going to use the salmon because that's our sacred fish. So you start off at the top. I'm a salmon, and I always will be a salmon. So that's really when you're in a free-spirited way. That's true self-determination, right? It's not self-determination that's signed in an agreement with Canada. It's something you proclaim for yourself. Then some authoritarianism comes in. Well, for some reason, it's not a good idea to be a salmon anymore, right? Then you internalize it. And this is the tragedy with so many of our kids. When they were being treated as if they weren't worth the money and they were getting less money for education and other things, what were they thinking? That they weren't saying I was discriminated against Canada. They said, I'm stupid. Look at what other kids can do, right? And that's true of many of us. We internalize it, somehow feeling that sense of disempowerment. And then like, why am I not like everybody else? And then more comes in, and then it's what was wrong with me. And then you don't even want to be called a salmon. This happened to me growing up in northern BC, right? It was far easier if people didn't know I was First Nations. Life just became easier, right? And then you get to a place where you say, I'm not a salmon, I'm a fish. And then all of a sudden is that, you're denying that whole reality. So that's kind of how undue influence works. So how does it work inside of the discriminator, I wondered. And I had worked in public service myself for 9 years, albeit at the very lowest level, right? I think they realized very quickly I was not cut out for rising through the ranks. They knew that before I knew that. And one of the reasons was is early on, and just to give you this kind of some concreteness to hold on here, I was at a staff meeting, and somebody from the head office was pirated down to our office. And everybody was to stop what they're doing for children and families, come in and listen to this person speak from headquarters. And they announced at that time, they said, well, we now have professional requirements for child protection workers. So everybody has to have a Bachelor of Social Work degree, right? Now, I do not. I had a Bachelor of Arts degree, and I had no intention of getting a Bachelor of Social Work degree. But so part of me just found my hand shooting up in the air despite myself. And I said, well, what evidence do you have for this actually making a difference, right? Because what I'm seeing out there is not even really social work stuff. It's like poverty, addictions, even back then. And the answer back was, again, not based on any kind of facts. It was, well, as soon as you've been around a while, you'll start to understand, right? And then when I was given the pep talk by the supervisor later about how we don't actually put our hands up in these meetings, it was like, there are 10 people out there who want your job. So for a while, I'm feeling really scared, and I go into conformity. I mean, I was one of the first in my family to ever see the inside of a high school, because the rest of our family was affected by residential schools. You don't want to shame your family or your community, and you also want to pay your rent, if I'm really honest. But then it finally dawned on me. One day I went to look at the Child Protection Office. I looked to the left, I looked to the right, and I looked straight on. There was nobody out there wanting to be a child protection worker. But I had built this fear around me that led to this conformity that was really unhelpful. So let's take a look at these folks. I have strong moral values, and I want to change things from the inside. And I've met some of these people. I want to give them credit. Some of them have done what they can. But then you get that little pep talk. And you need to be loyal. Loyalty is one of the, I think, something we need to talk more about. It's often viewed as benevolence. But what I've seen is that it actually can be loyalty to bad ideas gets rewarded. And so we have to be very cautious about loyalty. Then it's the kind of, well, I'm not really a fit. Then it's like, oh, I better not rock the boat. Then once you make that choice, and despite the bad outcomes, because at this point you're still kind of aware to this problem, you start to recalibrate it. And in many cases, they make themselves a victim. Right? You don't understand how many hours I'm putting in for your own good. Nothing will ever be good enough for you, etc. They create acronyms to describe our children, files, programs, etc., instead of thinking of these children as real sacred human beings. So that's the way that I think it kind of works in the bureaucracy. I think that that's where we got to with these 15 people. But then, you know, what happens inside of the discriminated group? I think that we have a similar journey. So you start off, you have inherent rights, and they're distinct rights. If you have inherent rights, you don't get those inherent rights by signing an agreement with Canada, right? It's something that you have just by virtue of who you are. Then they take our lands and they hurt our kids, and we don't want to do anything that would further hurt our kids. And then you start to get onto the sense of what's wrong with me. You start to internalize some of that racism. And then you get to the place where you say, well, the government says it wants to negotiate the inherent rights, so I'm going to sit down and talk to them about it. And then you do the photo op thing, right? I don't do photo ops anymore because that's their currency, right? That's the government's currency in these transactions. And it's not to criticize anybody. I've been a part of this myself. But it is about just kind of bringing to consciousness some of these markers and having conversations about that so that we can reset and actually make sure that we are moving things forward. So how did I kind of get out of this? It was a slow walk, and I think I'm still in the midst of it. But it began with that idea that, I think I started underwater, really, that the government is doing all this stuff because it doesn't know any better, right? Then I thought, well, give them the evidence and they'll do better. Then when they didn't do it, I thought, well, maybe they need better evidence, right? But then we filed the case, and then it was that thing, well, then they'll know we're serious and we're going to do something. When they cut the funding, that was actually a great liberation for us, because we had almost no money, and all of a sudden you had to be creative. And in colonialism, what I realized for myself is what Canada had done most successfully is two things. One is they took my ability to dream away and replaced it with their own dreams. And then second of all, they had allowed me to build these bars around my own potential to be part of the solution. I kind of disabled what I could do as an individual in there. And so I started to kind of challenge that stuff and throw myself into the field, even though I didn't know very much. And I was thankfully supported by a lot of folks. And now I'm at a place where I don't do photo ops with Canada. And I also think a lot about language. I think about the word Indigenous. I'm actually very concerned about that. I think it homogenizes the rich diversity of peoples that we have. And in the homogenization, it not only does it culturally, it also masks the injustices that are meted out differently for different groups, and there are associated solutions for those types of things. Even the whole conversation around reconciliation can be hijacked by others who make it into a performative thing. Apologies, I think, are often, we give them too easily. I was talking to an elder about an apology. She said, when you mess up, your first job is not to say, I'm sorry. Your first job is to learn the harm from the experience of those who had it. You don't define the harm as the one having perpetrated it. Then you need to demonstrate that you have learned from it for a sufficient period of time that other members of your group have confidence in you, that you have learned your lesson, but also that you've proven to others that you're no longer a danger. And you accept that ongoing monitoring, especially after you think you're okay, because that's when you're most dangerous of backslipping again. Then after all that, maybe an apology is necessary. But too often we let them get off with an apology, and the government is just repeating the same cycles as it did before. And I remember asking somebody, after a high-level bureaucrat in the Canadian government, after the case came down, I said, what is it that you learned from this discrimination? And how has that changed the way you think and behave? And all they could say is, it's an interesting question. And I think that's all they could say today, right? It's not enough to be able to say you're sorry. Like, why? What are you doing? How have you changed things? So a few of the things that I think really helped kind of refresh for me, one was involving kids. A lot of people think kids in a courtroom, that's probably not going to happen. Involving kids in litigation, that shouldn't happen. They won't understand things. But what they showed me is that children can see things with such laser-focused clarity. They don't accept all the rationalizations that people go around with, and they haven't been bathed in this colonial bathwater for as long as many of us. So we would have kids come into the courtroom, and they would say things like that one child did, that discrimination is when you're not worth the money. They said they had this one child who had kept a score sheet, with the hashtags. They were listening to Canada's testimony, and what we said to the kids is, you have to listen to everybody in order to understand something. And then you go back and you do research in your school, and you talk to your family, and then you come to something that you think you believe, and then you do something about it. Well, that child had done a score sheet, and there was a long list of hashtags on one side and a short side on the other. And he said the long list is when the government people were asked a question, and the short list is when they answered. Right? So instead of doing work for children, involving children in the piece and making them the long-term remedy to discrimination, because if we can raise a generation of non-Indigenous children who can see the discrimination so clearly and have peaceful and respectful ways of being able to defend against it, that's going to have more sustainable benefit than litigation alone. Starting to have those kind of critical examinations about why do we have these normative relationships with government? Like, What is the value of meeting with a minister, truly, at the end of the day, right? Just kind of like, not to say that some of these things aren't necessary, but to really make it a conscious and deliberate choice as to whether it's in service of really being the fellow carrier of colonialism or whether it's actually going to disrupt it. That negotiation is better thing, that's what I'm living in real time right now. We have the litigation, it's been really successful for kids, and Canada, of course, now wants to negotiate. And how do they want to negotiate? They want to do it in secret, right? And there's a sense that if you come over here and you play by our rules, not only is that, they'll say that the colonial court system isn't working. Well, the colonial court system has actually done more for First Nations kids than this negotiation piece has over there. But that's the invitation. Go over there, talk to us in secret, and good things will happen. And so, and I found myself just accepting that on first brush, right? Well, yeah, I guess sitting down and talking is a better way. But then you had to stop yourself and say, well, that never worked before, right? Class actions. This is something I'm very concerned about, and I see that you have them popping up here. We have them popping up everywhere in Canada. And what it's meant is a great industry for law firms who are getting unbelievable class action fees. And what I'm concerned about most often is that when you have people who have experienced injustice, they tell their truths because they don't want their children to go through it, or grandchildren, or anybody else to go through it. That's the number one motivator. And what we're seeing happen with these class actions is, under the promise of some kind of alleged reform, these class actions get launched, and then you have payments to individuals who are often vulnerable that sometimes even deepen the injustice. But they never deliver on the reform agenda, right? So I think we have to kind of just be aware of these new forms of injustice and perpetrating it, that sometimes a remedy that looks like justice actually just deepens the injustice. I would like to see class actions, for example. I was inspired by an example in the UK where the survivors came forward and they said, well, if you want to mete out real justice for us, we want access to the federal government's pension plan. We want priority for public housing. Like, that's going to go a longer way in ensuring that person and their descendants have a better set of life than a $40,000 payment. Especially when lawyers are taking these class actions and often getting into the tens of millions. In fact, we had, and forgive me, you know, like this was an Indigenous law firm, but they just, they were requesting a $500 million legal fee on a $10 billion class action. Like, that type of stuff isn't justice to me. And that's where we have to have the courageous conversations in our own communities too. So, you know, we're able to do all of these good things, but I've also really been reminded and made to understand that you're most at risk of losing just before you win, or even better, after you've cut the ribbon. And there was a non-Indigenous negotiator who said to me, you know, you need to judge any agreement by the day after the lawyers have feasted. And what he was getting at there is, what is the actual lived reality for those children? Not only, because in my game, my work, it's not just the children who are here today. We want to make this discrimination stop for all generations of kids. So what does that actually look like for them? What if we left the communities, their leadership, the people on the front lines in these families with these tools to enforce against this discrimination? So that's the piece that we're really working at right now. I know these are unbelievable numbers, but what that should do is remind you of the depth of the discrimination that existed in the first instance, right? And we also can't be blinded that this is a case not about every inequality. So these types of inequalities are continuing in other ways. And how do we create a public narrative that doesn't think, well, when this is figured out, all the inequality problems are solved. They can go back to sleep mode. And in doing that, of course, we found from Bryce and others, that continues the injustice. So, you know, I think I am starting to understand a few things. I've got a long way to go. And one of them is to really always keep my eye on the kids. Because it is so intoxicating sometimes when you have a big legal win like that and it feels like, oh, wow, we've done a good thing. And you have done a good thing, but it's not changed anything. To ask that question, if you can walk into, will that child tell you that it's a better life? To expect non-compliance. I used to think that governments were logical and moral. Therefore, giving them, evidence, solutions, and the fact that they have an opportunity to help kids, like who wouldn't get on board with that? But I've since kind of understood them more as sociopaths. In that you have to create the conditions for their self-survival in order for them to really be motivated for change. And that means that we spend less time talking to the government and more time talking to Canadians. That's the landscape we need to do. And by entering in with young children, they take those messages back to their families, and we would get a lot of take-up that way. Expect an attempt to reframe the problem. We've seen that a lot where now the government is saying the problem is the First Nations agencies. They're removing these kids. The problem isn't that we have underfunded these First Nations agencies for a long period of time. So that is another distraction where they are taking carriage of defining the problem away from their own accountability. We need to measure the outcomes to make sure we're doing the right thing. Like, we often think, well, we'll send these kids off to a cultural camp and that'll deal with it. Well, it'll deal with some things, but it's not going to deal with everything. So we have to be holding ourselves accountable as we're negotiating these new spaces. Especially, I wish we were as well organized as the drug dealers are. They can get anywhere on the planet, right? They ship their product out there, it's more and more potent. So we have to just be as ingenious and resourceful as they are, even more, because our mission is to really restore the dignity and the health and well-being of our peoples. So this is something that's just happened in Canada about the reframing. So you can see there that the overrepresentation both would agree is a problem, but Canada is now saying it's the First Nations people, professionals in the region are their problem. And so that is that's a disrespect to these people who have often been doing this work for 20, 30 years. But on offer is a very simple solution. If you get rid of those agencies and if you proclaim self-government, all these problems will go away. And I'm increasingly worried that the promise of self-determination is really about government offloading. And I think that that's part of what we need to kind of talk about is, reclaiming your own laws. Like we're given this opportunity in Canada through gets jurisdiction in child welfare. Well, the answer to that question is, can you have jurisdiction in something that is not familiar to your traditional ways of law? So when we unpack some of the laws in Canada for First Nations communities, there's no child welfare law. They're holistic laws, and they're clan laws or family laws. So when Canada is saying you can have jurisdiction in child welfare, they're really entrenching a Western program under the guise of self-government. That's problem number one. Problem number two is they're only interested in giving us self-government over things that cost them money, right? So you don't hear them talking about, well, let's do self-government to make sure that the resources that are being extracted actually go to these people. That's not on the table. What else are they targeting? Health, education, etc. And they're not that concerned about what level of capacity has your community had and the opportunity to deliver these services. Because at the end of the day, they're going to reframe as they did on child welfare, which is, we gave you what you want, and now look at you. Right? So we need to kind of avoid using self-government as a shiny penny. It's not going to solve all the problems. And so we need to make sure that we're building a good foundation of addressing those structural issues while also making sure that we're true. If we really want to go down this traditional law route, then let's bring forward the traditional law, not just some segment of it. One of our First Nations leaders, Gitxsan from the Squamish Nation, is a very brilliant First Nations young leader. The way he's getting around this is he actually is writing a constitution with his community. So if you think about it as a tree, what was the trunk of the tree of those values of their nation? that ought to be infiltrating all of these different laws and then using that to inform these other laws so they're coordinated and are closer to their particular view. So there's a lot of brilliant thinkers out there about how to advantage that. Mercifully for all of you, I'm about to wind up. But if you want to kind of see some of this stuff in action, we have a beautiful Abenaki filmmaker, Elenisa Bomsawin, who is 92 years old right now. And for those of you feeling tired, she's working on about 5 documentaries at any given time. So she can certainly outlast me doing anything. But she's done documentaries on the case in a documentary film called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. You'll actually see the government witnesses on the stand. You'll see me on the stand. You'll see the children in the courtroom. Jordan River Anderson, we didn't have a lot of time to talk about Jordan's principle, but it's a remedy, it's a substantive equality remedy for the deep discrimination that we're finding for First Nations kids. And it's been life-changing for many children. But what it's pointing out are the deep inequalities in these other areas, education, health, etc. The remedy ought to be funding those properly. But in the meantime, we got the finger in the dike of at least being able to provide that child, maybe with the learning assessment they need, or the tutoring, or the language or cultural supports. And for us, I was so inspired by these kids and how they personify loving justice that I wanted to do something that I've never done before, and that is write a book. I get a lot of students, forgive me, they would come up to me and say, oh, we read your book, and I knew they knew nothing about me because I never wrote any books. I don't have the patience or the dedication to do any such thing. But on this one, I really wanted to give back to the children the example that they provided to me. And so we have actually animations and children's stories that tell the true story of how children of all diversities stood with First Nations children for justice. And what was so wonderful about it, it wasn't charity they were standing for. The children knew instinctually that they needed to stand up for justice, and that was better for the whole society to grow up in that way. So yeah, we got a lot of things. Our whole office is covered with bears. So what I wish I would have known, and I want to just remind everybody, I'm still bathing in these bath waters and trying to tread, and that's why coming to places like this is such a good idea for me, because I see different levels of conversation, different ways of thinking about things that are awakening. Because I find that it's easier to see discrimination in another country than it is in your own country. So when I see things here, I take it, well, gee, we have that same thing there, but I'm not shocked about it in the same way that I ought to be. The piece is falling in love with the children. That's got to be the outcome. And then, the other piece is just using peaceful and non-voluntary actions. Being inspired by the many great advocates around the globe. On social media, that's what I follow most people who have done social advocacy of all different types of diversity to be able to take myself to school. Because we say as a medical student, you need to be a good advocate, or a social worker, you need to be a good advocate. But we don't teach people how to do it. And we also don't teach people about how to be morally courageous. So that when the chips are down, they actually do make the right decision at the right time and not be a fellow traveler in the injustice. Don't rely on process. Be very skeptical about processes, inquests, royal commissions, etc. Look backwards and see if the problem's well defined, whether there's solutions already there. If there are, then this is a question of implementation. I hear people say, well, I'll offer my truce. It's a new time. I'm finding those same truths are basically the same story I heard 40 years ago. And rely on evidence. That's what, to me, is one of the critical things as a demarcation between social injustice and social justice, is that you hold yourself accountable to evidence. Because that's the best thing we have to be able to calibrate doing right versus trying to be right. And in social injustice, there's usually very little evidence to anchor that, which makes your work really important. It's an accountability mechanism for us, more than it is for others. With that, I just want to say it's been a real privilege to spend time with you, and you've been most patient with me. So I think I'll wrap it up there. Thank you. Sure.
Cindy, thank you so much for your presentation. Your work and your expert disruption is inspiring, so I really appreciate listening to you this evening. I think you've been really on point as well. You know, we're 12 months past a resounding no vote to our referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. We have record numbers of Indigenous children in care, and we're actually in the midst of a crisis when it comes to family violence and violence against women. So, you know, there's so many learnings that we can take from what you've presented this afternoon. So thank you so much. And we've just got a small token of our appreciation.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think we might have time for a few questions, if there are any.
Or even better ideas.
There you go, yeah, better ideas.
Stuff I've missed that I've got wrong.
Yeah. Any questions from the floor?
It's pretty straightforward. What are the grounds for the case against the Canadian government, please?
Discrimination. So what we chose to do, and this is one of the pieces that where we had to readjust, many of the legal cases in Canada were based on Aboriginal rights and title. And we have a piece, we're lucky, and we have something in our Constitution called Section 35 that allows for those arguments, which I know is not something that you have here. And that is a big tool for us. But in this case, what we realized is, and this is part of my own lived experience, I come from the Gitxsan, we argued successfully a case called Delgamuut. And what we found is that when the Supreme Court would rule that Canada's behavior was unconstitutional, Canada would often just not do anything. And it was that they didn't have any kind of enforcement powers. So we were looking for something that had enforcement powers. And we're also looking for something where we could get better public support. So we framed it around the equality jurisprudence. And we said Canada's failure to treat First Nations children substantively equally in child and family services and in Jordan's principle for health and social was racial discrimination on the prohibited grounds of race and national ethnic origin. And we chose a mechanism called the Canadian Human Rights Act. We could have gone under the charter, but that left us in the same place as Delgamuut. We would have had a finding of fact, but no remedy. And so we looked actually at the lower system, the Canadian Human Rights Court, which is at the lowest tier of our federal court. But they have their quasi-constitutional body, and they can order specific remedies. And because of all the work collectively that have been done over the years, we had the specific remedies. And so that's what's been so effective about that. We're worried, I think, in fairness, that Canada will now see that that tool could be used against them. They always anticipated it to be used against businesses and other entities. So who knows how long that tool will be there. But we found the equality jurisprudence a better hill to fight on. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia, for the question. Any other questions?
Over in Perth, did you meet the women campaigning on the Banksia Hill situation?
No.
Banksia Hill is a juvenile detention centre in southwest Western Australia, and over 90% of the children are Aboriginal. A very large proportion of them come from the far north, from the Kimberley, and a very large proportion of them have some form of brain injury, and some proportion of the brain injury is FASD. And they are treated as criminals, and the standards at which they're treated fall far below United Nations standards. We have jurisdictions in Australia that won't allow United Nations inspections teams into the country. Queensland's one of them. And Western Australia, the Western Australian jurisdiction simply refuses to reform its juvenile justice system. And I think that system has had at least 2 child suicides in the last year. So we have a problem greater than thousands of children being in out-of-home care. some very high proportion of Aboriginal children are detained in detention centres and they're destined for prisons and early deaths. So I just wanted you to know about that.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we can mirror that. We have, as I said earlier, like we have the overrepresentation of First Nations children in child welfare, overrepresented in juvenile justice, overrepresented in the prisons. We're at the top of every list you don't want to be at the top of, and the bottom of every list you do want to be a part of. And that's what's kind of led to us experimenting around these causal factors. If we were able to affect this by, even in our small way, leveraging these families up to a substantive equality, a little bit closer, will that have the potential of remediating some of these disadvantages? That's yet to be seen. Because we're also dealing with the counterpower of the increasing opioid crisis, right? The potency of opioids, which is making this job much harder. But on its merits, it's one of the best ideas we've come up with so far. And we need to measure it and see whether or not it actually has that difference, taking into context those contextual factors.
Yeah, and we did have some conversation this morning about the Dondale
Yeah.
Detention Centre and the Western Australian Centre too. Yeah.
Fortunately, I don't know if Hood's being used. But we've had a lot of kids die of suicide as detention centers. And we've also had, just this last couple months, Indigenous prisoners who have been killed, had untimely deaths in there. Some of them by restraint, others by just neglect of their basic needs. And so this kind of thing is happening, right? And the question is, what can we do about it? And where do we start that journey, right?
Absolutely. Any other questions or ideas or answers to these questions that Cindy's
And
posing?
if you have further ideas, you can send them to me because I do have email. I think we have to kind of collectively, internationally challenge some of these problems and figure out ways of kind of having the conversation because the situation is so similar.
Yeah.
And we can't wait for this justice because in real time, people are experiencing the worst consequences of it.
Yeah. I think we have a question over here.
Thank you for a fabulous presentation. You mentioned the need to stop talking with the government and start talking more with the people of Canada as your allies. How is that process going?
Yeah, it's, I'll say that just to give you an example of how effective it can be, is after the 215 children were made international headlines about being in the unmarked graves from residential schools. That was in June. So Canada's birthday celebration is July 1st. And on that day, we saw far more people wearing orange shirts, which is a symbol of residential school survivors and also the importance of implementing TRC calls to action, than we did red and white shirts. In the 6 weeks that happened, the Canadian government implemented more of the TRC calls to action than they had in the previous 6 years. But then people fell asleep again. And so we're seeing this thing move at a very slow pace. In our case, I think the first thing was how do we frame up the case? And so we got a lot of inspiration from people like George Lakoff, Frameworks Institute, about how do we describe, not necessarily the problem, because a lot of people knew that First Nations children were suffering, but it was more about where we wanted to go. So our tagline is so that First Nations children have a fair chance to grow up safely in their families, get a good education, be healthy and proud of who they are. And the reason is we wanted an invitation that anybody could relate to and be a part of. Then that also allowed us to use a variety of tools. Litigation, we had 7 ways to make a difference in under 2 minutes so that we would challenge Canadians to do. We were in the schools. Kids were writing letters directly to the Prime Minister, in some cases to the UN, doing all these different types of experiments. But we were given the luxury of being able to fail at some of these strategies because we didn't make the tool the outcome. And I think that really did work for us. I think right now, though, it's especially challenging, right? with the global insecurity and the downfall of democracies and also the rise of this intolerance, will we be able to endure that in a way that captures the Canadian consciousness? I think that's a real challenge for which I don't have the answer. I'm hoping that we can. But I think that's something that all of us need to be doing. And in academia, I'd like to see far more deliberation on things like artificial intelligence, on undue influence, on a grand scale, about how to remedy that. It just feels like in my profession that we're dealing with the problems of 20 years ago. And I was reminded of a police officer. He said, in doing what's urgent, you miss what's important. And I think the important stuff are these big, grand things. And if we don't pay much attention to them, then a lot of other dominoes fall in an unfortunate direction.
A question over here.
Obviously, you mentioned the health side, the issues that you have faced in your process of 20 years. What were the problems faced for providing access to education to the Indigenous people, just so that even they can find out about their rights or process?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it had been normalized. I remember growing up as a little kid. I grew up in the bush, right? Not on reserve. And I remember going to the reserve, and I didn't see a lot of stuff that people had off reserve. But it always had been that way, so we had normalized it. When it comes to education, First Nations schools are dramatically underfunded, both in resources, and some of the buildings are just in terrible condition, right? And this had been kind of traveling along for a long period of time, and people had normalized it. I can't claim any credit for denormalizing it. Who was able to denormalize it was a 13-year-old First Nations girl named Shannon Kustachin. And what she did is she grew up in a community 1,200 kilometers north of Toronto. Their school was built on a toxic waste dump of over 50,000 gallons of diesel that had linked in there from the flawed heating system. And the kids were all getting sick and everything else like this. So the Canadian government, after this hit the headlines, said, oh, no problem, we'll bring up portable trailers and we'll work on a new school for you. Well, 10 years on, that new school had not appeared. And where did they put the portable trailers? On the playground of that contaminated school. So what did this kid do? You know, she's thinking they had raised money for their grade 8 graduation, which was a big deal. Like, I grew up in the bush. I did not want to go to camp on the land. I was living on the land. I wanted to go to the mall, right? I wanted to go see a movie in a theater. And they were like that. They had raised all this money so they could do that. But when the government announced that they couldn't get a new school because the government couldn't afford it, these grade 8 students met together and said, we're going to use the money to send Shannon and 2 friends down to meet with the government instead. And she stood against the government and she said, you know, school's a time for dreams and every kid deserves this. And I am not going to give up until you give us a new school. And she self-initiated the largest children's rights campaign of writing letters to the government in Canadian history. Through her advocacy, not only did they get a new school, but the Canadian public became much more aware of the gross inequalities in there. And I think that that's something that where we need to really value children. It's unfortunate they carry that burden. Other kids get to grow up and do other things, but for some of our kids, they have to grow up and learn how to do this. But she was the human face of that discrimination. And you couldn't help but look at this extremely bright, capable young woman and think about what an injustice it was that she went to a school that had ice on the inside that was this thick. So it's that breakthrough of humanizing it, I think, that really helps. And you can check it out, Shannon's Dream.
Yes.
Lovely. Well, I think that might be all the questions. So we might, please join me in thanking Professor Blackstock for your lecture. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Cindy. So that brings us to the end of the formal part of the evening. I'd just like to once again thank Professor Blackstock for such an inspiring lecture this evening. Thank you for being a human rights, a child human rights champion for our children and for all the work that you've done and shared with us this evening. I'd like to thank Professor Jane Gunn, thank you for this evening, and to Sandy's team, Professor Sandra Eads' team, the Indigenous Development team. Thank you very much for all the hard work that you've done pulling this evening together. Please join us for some more refreshments and continue the conversation. Thank you.